What would you do if you saw a man in uniform being handcuffed in broad daylight, simply because he didn't look like someone in power? This isn't a scene from a movie, it's a true story that unfolded in a small American town. But the biggest shock? The man they arrested wasn't just anyone. He was one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. And what happened next left the entire nation speechless. It was a golden, tranquil afternoon in a quiet suburban town in Virginia. The streets were calm, the air carried the scent of blooming magnolias, and the gentle hum of daily life moved unbothered, until something shifted. A black SUV pulled up slowly in front of the county courthouse. Its door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a sharply pressed U.S. military uniform. The medals on his chest gleamed under the sun: distinguished service, combat honors, decades of dedication. His stride was purposeful but calm, the walk of someone used to respect, to command. This was General William Carter, though nobody recognized him just yet. He had barely taken a few steps toward the courthouse when two local police officers on patrol took notice. Their eyes narrowed, and one of them instinctively placed a hand near his holster. The general's presence, instead of invoking respect, triggered something else: suspicion. Without introducing themselves or asking why he was there, they approached with tight, forced politeness. "Can I see some ID?" one of them asked, his tone already implying distrust. General Carter, unshaken but clearly taken aback, reached into his inner jacket pocket and handed them his military-issued identification card. His fingers moved slowly, calm, deliberate, knowing how quickly things could spiral. "I'm here for a private hearing. My name is General William Carter." The officer looked at the ID for only a second before scoffing. "This looks fake. Anyone can print this," he muttered. The general's brows furrowed slightly, disbelief flickering in his eyes, but he remained silent. Then, without warning, the second officer moved in. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "What?" "Officer, I think there's been a mistake," General Carter tried to explain, but he was already being handcuffed, right there on the sidewalk, in full view of passers-by. The pain wasn't just in the steel pressing against his wrists. It was in the humiliation, the disbelief, the quiet fury building in his chest. A man who had risked his life for this country was now being paraded like a criminal in the very nation he had sworn to protect. Around them, bystanders began to pause. Some looked confused, others shocked. A few pulled out their phones. The sight was surreal, a decorated war hero being arrested in broad daylight. For what? For existing in a place where his uniform wasn't enough. He said nothing as the cuffs clicked shut. But his eyes, they burned, not with rage, but with a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. The interrogation room was bare, its cement walls painted in a shade of pale gray that seemed to leach the warmth out of everything. General William Carter sat silently in a cold metal chair, his hands bound behind him with steel cuffs that dug lightly into his wrists. His back was straight, chin lifted with quiet dignity, but his eyes, sharp, steely, betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Every muscle in his body ached, not from the restraint, but from what it represented. He had walked into the police station just an hour ago, prepared to stand as a character witness in a case involving a young boy he had mentored through a community outreach program. Instead, he'd been handcuffed in the lobby, no questions asked, after being accused of impersonating a military official. The arresting officer hadn't even looked at his ID long enough to notice the dozens of ribbons and medals embedded in his file. Around him, the officers moved without urgency. One typed slowly on a computer, stealing occasional glances like he was observing something foreign, something he couldn't quite believe existed in front of him. Another leaned against the wall with an expression that hovered between boredom and indifference. No one offered an apology. No one offered water. No one offered humanity. Then the door creaked open, and Officer Daniels stepped in, holding a thin manila folder in his hands. He glanced down at the file, then up at the man seated before him, and in that instant, his face changed. Shock registered first. Then discomfort. Then something closer to shame. "Sir," Daniels said, his voice unsure, I believe there's been a terrible mistake." The room froze. The officer who had arrested Carter rolled his eyes. He was acting sketchy. And that ID looked fake. "You can't just walk in here dressed like a general and expect us not to question it." Daniels looked up from the file, voice firmer now. "That's because it isn't fake. This man is General William Carter. He's a retired 4-star general. Served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's received the Medal of Freedom, the Silver Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross. And Judge Monroe specifically asked him to testify in court this morning." A heavy silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that didn't just make people uncomfortable, it demanded they feel uncomfortable. General Carter slowly turned his head toward the officer who had arrested him. His expression remained unreadable, but his voice was low, unwavering. "You didn't even ask for my name," he said. "You looked at my face, my skin, and decided I didn't belong in that uniform." The cuffs clicked open with trembling hands. The officer avoided his gaze. Carter stood, slow and deliberate. He adjusted his jacket with the quiet precision of someone trained never to show weakness, even when humiliated. But as he glanced around the room, his voice carried more weight than any shout ever could. "I didn't serve this country for medals," he said. "I served so that every man, woman, and child could be treated with the dignity they deserve. And today, right here, you reminded me that sometimes a uniform means nothing when the skin underneath is still judged first." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked toward the door. Each step echoed like a drumbeat. The handle clicked gently as he opened it, and for a moment, the entire room stood still, caught in the quiet aftermath of a man's broken trust. He didn't look back. As General Carter stepped out of the police station and into the harsh morning light, a sudden weight pressed down on him, as though the very air around him had thickened. He stood at the top of the steps for a moment, his eyes squinting against the brightness, yet his mind was far from the sun's warmth. There was no feeling of relief, no sense of victory in escaping the cold grip of the handcuffs. Instead, all he could hear was the pounding rhythm of his own pulse in his ears and the dull ache that seemed to radiate from deep within his chest. His mind replayed the events in that sterile interrogation room over and over. The looks of suspicion from his colleagues, the faint smirk on the officer's face when he was finally released. They hadn't just doubted his authority, they had questioned his very identity. For a man like him, who had commanded respect in battle, had led men through the most grueling of situations, it was a feeling that hit far harder than any bullet or blade could. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his phone. He could feel the weight of it there, heavy with expectation. He needed to move past this, to get ahead of the storm that was building inside him, but everything felt like it was moving too slowly. His hand clenched the phone tighter, steadying himself for what came next. He dialed Judge Monroe's number, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, though his mind was 100 miles away. The phone rang twice before the judge picked up, his voice as sharp and unyielding as always. "General Carter," Monroe's voice crackled through the line. "What's the situation?" "Send a car to the 14th precinct." Carter's voice was cold, measured, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath it. "I'll be in court in an hour. We need to finish this." There was a pause on the other end, a brief flicker of disbelief, but the judge knew better than to question him. Monroe's response was swift and firm. "I'll have it arranged." The call ended, and for a moment, Carter just held the phone in his hand, staring at the screen as if it held the answers he was looking for. But there were no answers here, only the crushing weight of responsibility that had always been his. The responsibility that had made him who he was. The responsibility that now seemed to be slipping through his fingers, as though the world was steadily chipping away at everything he had worked so hard to build. Minutes passed before a black sedan pulled up in front of the station. The driver opened the door without a word, and Carter slipped into the back seat, the door closing behind him with a solid thud. He leaned back, his body rigid, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The car moved through the streets, the sound of the engine humming softly in the background, but Carter barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, swirling around the young boy who was at the center of all this. Marcus. A kid who had been dealt an unjust hand by a system that was supposed to protect him. Carter's jaw tightened as the memory of the boy's face in the courtroom flashed through his mind. Marcus was scared, he could see it in his eyes, the way he fidgeted, the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke. Carter knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of countless soldiers before they were sent into battle. That fear. That desperation. But Marcus was not a soldier. He was a kid, caught in the middle of a war he didn't understand, a war of assumptions and prejudice that had already claimed too many victims. He couldn't let that happen to Marcus. Carter exhaled slowly, pushing his frustration aside. He had no room for self-pity. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. His mind flicked back to the conversation in the station, the accusations thrown at him, accusations that, if proven true, could destroy everything he had worked for. But he wasn't going to let it. He couldn't. He was a general, a man who had led troops into the most dangerous corners of the world and had always come out victorious. He wasn't going to let one mistake, one misunderstanding, define him. The courthouse appeared on the horizon, its tall stone columns casting long shadows across the pavement. As the car drew closer, Carter's heart beat a little faster. He wasn't just heading to court to testify, he was heading to battle, and this time, the battlefield was far more personal. When the car finally stopped, Carter didn't hesitate. He stepped out with the same precise, controlled movements he had perfected over the years. His uniform, crisp and immaculate, seemed to reflect the man he had become, unyielding, resolute. He adjusted his jacket, squared his shoulders, and made his way up the courthouse steps. The eyes of the world would be on him today, and he would not flinch. Now for a second. "They think this will break me," Carter muttered under his breath, his voice low and determined, as if speaking to the world itself. "But they're wrong. This will make me stronger." And with that, he entered the courthouse, ready to face whatever came next, not just for himself, but for the justice that was owed. The courthouse was quieter than usual, but the silence was far from peaceful. It was thick with unspoken judgments, with hushed whispers that seemed to float in the air, swirling like smoke around Carter as he made his way down the long corridor. Each footstep he took seemed to echo off the cold, marble floors, reverberating in his mind, reminding him of the weight of what was to come. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked, some curious, some judgmental, and some full of silent accusation. He was no stranger to pressure. As an officer, he'd faced countless high-stakes situations, hostage rescues, dangerous criminals, and tense negotiations. But this was different. This wasn't a mission with a clear end. This wasn't something he could control with his instincts, or force into submission with his experience. This trial was an entirely different kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with words, perception, and the law. Carter clenched his jaw, trying to push the nagging thoughts from his mind, but they crept back in, relentless, inevitable. The accusations, the questions about his actions, the way the public had begun to turn on him. His stomach tightened. He had always believed in the system, in doing things by the book, but now, standing on the precipice of his career's fate, he couldn't help but wonder if the system would fail him. The quiet muttering from the onlookers made his chest tighten, the uncertainty swelling like a balloon ready to burst. Every whisper seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 opinions, none of which had any real understanding of what had happened, of what he had done that day. He had acted swiftly, decisively, just as he was trained. But in the eyes of others, his decisions were starting to feel like a double-edged sword. As he approached the courtroom doors, his steps slowed, almost involuntarily. He knew he should keep moving, keep his head focused, but for a brief moment, the weight of the situation bore down on him. His fingers tightened around the straps of his bag, his grip cold and firm, grounding him. There was no turning back now. Inside those doors awaited the judgment that could destroy him or clear his name. He had spent the entire night replaying every detail of the incident in his head, but the truth was, there was no one to turn to. No one could understand what it had been like to stand in the middle of that chaos, to make a split-second decision that could have cost someone their life. He breathed in deeply, letting the air fill his lungs, calming the nerves that had started to creep up on him. He didn't have the luxury of self-doubt. Not now. Not in this moment. His hands, usually steady and firm, felt cold and clammy as he reached for the door handle. But as soon as his fingers closed around it, a sense of finality hit him, a weightier pressure than anything he had felt before. The courtroom beyond was a stage, and he was about to step into the spotlight. Carter pushed the doors open, and as he stepped through, a heavy silence fell. The room seemed to freeze in place, every eye turning toward him. He could feel the gaze of the jury, the press, the lawyers, everyone, and each one of those eyes seemed to pierce straight through him, weighing him, judging him. But he forced himself not to flinch, not to acknowledge the tension in the air. His movements were deliberate as he walked towards the witness stand, his boots clicking sharply on the marble floor, each step echoing louder in his mind than the last. Inside, his heart was hammering, but his face was a mask of calm. He had learned long ago how to bury his emotions beneath layers of professionalism, but inside, there was a storm. Anxiety gripped his chest, but beneath that, there was something else, something deeper. A fierce sense of determination, a need to prove that he had done the right thing. No matter how the world saw him, he knew the truth. And the truth was something he would never let go of. He settled into the chair at the witness stand, feeling the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on him. The defense attorney stood, and with a voice laced with sarcasm, began to tear into him, questioning his every decision. It was like a slow burn, each accusation another spark threatening to set him ablaze. His jaw clenched, but he didn't react, not outwardly. He would not let them see his frustration. He had learned how to control the tide of emotions inside him, to keep them from spilling over when things got difficult. His mind, however, was spinning. The words the attorney was using felt like daggers, each one aimed to discredit him, to strip away the trust he had worked so hard to build. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him, the air thick and suffocating. But he steadied himself. His breathing evened out, his thoughts sharpening. He had come here for a reason. He had been trained for moments like this. When the attorney finally paused, Carter stood, his posture straight and unwavering. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, but this time, he didn't shrink away. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. His voice was steady, despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "I've never been one to back down from a fight," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "But I'm not here to fight for my own sake. I'm here because what happened that day was bigger than me. Bigger than anyone in this room. and I will not let my name be dragged through the mud because of someone else's assumptions. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable, as his words hung in the air. He knew that in the coming moments, the jury would decide his fate. But he had made his stand. He had laid the truth bare, and now, there was nothing left to do but wait for the judgment. The room was quiet, but it felt as if the walls were closing in around him. The air was thick with tension, and Carter could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the courtroom. His pulse thudded loudly in his ears, drowning out everything else, and his hands, though gripping the edge of the witness stand with an almost unnatural force, trembled ever so slightly. He had always been known for his calm demeanor, the way he could maintain control in high-pressure situations, but today, nothing seemed easy. Each breath he took felt like a struggle, as though the very act of inhaling was pulling him deeper into the storm of uncertainty swirling inside him. The defense attorney was relentless, each question sharper than the last, slicing through his composure with precision. Carter had been through tough situations before, grueling investigations, moments of chaos, but this was different. This was personal. This wasn't just about following protocol or executing his duty, it was about who he was, his character, and whether anyone could understand the complexity of his decisions that day. As the attorney's words hit him, one after another, he could feel the pressure mounting. The questions weren't just probing, they were accusing, attempting to strip him of his integrity, to paint him as a man who acted rashly, a man who had let emotions cloud his judgment. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising tide of frustration and fear. He could feel it deep in his chest, an aching, hollow feeling that he knew too well, the feeling of doubt creeping in, threatening to undermine everything he had worked for. Was he wrong? Had he made the right call? His mind raced, memories of the day flooding back in vivid flashes, the panic, the chaos, the choice he had to make in an instant. The decision that had felt right then, but now, under the cold light of scrutiny, seemed like it could crumble with the slightest push. He forced himself to focus, to block out the rising panic threatening to overwhelm him. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the jury. Their faces were impassive, unreadable, and yet he could almost feel the weight of their judgment pressing against him. Was there any part of them that understood? Did they see the bigger picture, or were they caught in the weeds of legal technicalities? His gaze lingered on the foreman for a moment, a man whose posture remained rigid, as though he were carving himself into stone. But the silence between them felt thick and heavy. The jury's eyes were locked onto him, scrutinizing every word, every movement, as though trying to unravel his soul. Carter took another deep breath, his chest tightening, but he refused to show weakness. He had been in situations where his training had been tested, where lives hung in the balance, and yet this was different. This was the first time he had ever felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had led to this moment. The attorney's voice sliced through his thoughts again, cold and relentless, pushing him to a breaking point. "You didn't consider the risks, did you?" she asked, her tone accusing, her eyes sharp as daggers. Carter's hands tightened, the tension in his shoulders building as though he were preparing to snap. "I considered everything," he replied, his voice steady, though a hint of frustration leaked through. "I consider the lives at stake, the lives of those I was sworn to protect. My job isn't just about following orders. It's about making decisions when there's no time to hesitate." But even as the words left his mouth, he could hear the crack in his own voice. Was it enough? Did it even make sense to anyone else? The doubt gnawed at him, more insistent than ever. He had done what he thought was right. He had acted out of instinct, out of necessity, to save lives. But could anyone else see that? Could they understand the depth of what he had gone through? The moments of fear, of uncertainty, of sheer desperation, when the world seemed to fall away and all that mattered was the choice he made in that instant? Carter's eyes briefly flicked to the prosecutor, a woman whose piercing gaze seemed to cut through him. He knew she was waiting for him to crack, to show weakness. She had been methodical in her approach, and her every question seemed designed to test him, to make him question everything he had done. He stood tall, his back straight, but inside, he was a battlefield. His mind reeled as he thought back to the chaotic moments of that fateful day, how everything had unfolded so quickly. The urgency, the noise, the fear in people's eyes. How could anyone understand that? How could they comprehend the weight of the decisions he had to make? He had been thrust into a situation where the right choice wasn't clear, where each action seemed to come with its own set of consequences. The truth was, he had acted on instinct. And while that felt right in his heart, it didn't seem enough to explain it to those who only saw the surface. As the prosecutor continued her questioning, Carter clenched his fists, willing himself to focus. There was nothing more to do now but stand firm, to hold on to his truth. If he faltered, if he allowed doubt to creep in any further, it would be over. "I did what I thought was best," Carter said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper, but it held the weight of everything. "Sometimes, you don't have time to think. You just act. And I acted with everything I had." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the jury once more, hoping, praying, that they could see the sincerity in his words. That they could understand the weight of his actions, the sacrifice he had made, even if it was hard to see the bigger picture. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't perfect. But he had tried, with everything in him, to do the right thing. General William Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He let the truth speak for itself, and when it did, it roared louder than any weapon ever could. In a country still wrestling with prejudice and perception, his quiet dignity became a battle cry for justice. Maybe it's time we all looked a little deeper before we judge what we see.